Imagine a child born on a rugged Mediterranean island, far from the gilded salons of Paris or the marbled halls of European power. His father was a minor noble. His homeland, recently conquered, his family, more hopeful than wealthy. And yet, this boy would go on to redraw the map of Europe, shatter monarchies, and crown himself emperor. Have you ever wondered how a nobody from a distant island could rise to command the world's most formidable armies? And what kind of fire must burn inside a man to make him believe he could rewrite destiny itself? Today we embark on a journey through the meteoric rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. From a modest Corsican upbringing to the thunderous applause of Notre Dame Cathedral, where he placed the crown on his own head. This isn't just the tale of a man who seized power. It's the story of ambition sharpened by adversity, genius kindled by chaos, and a legacy still debated in classrooms and war rooms alike. So stay with us, because this tale isn't just history. It's a mirror reflecting the very soul of ambition. And before we dive in, let us know in the comments, what moment in history do you think changed the world forever? Early life and background, 1769 to 1885. Born on August 15th, 1769, in the sun-soaked town of Ajaccio on the island of Corsica, Napoleon Bonaparte entered a world teetering on the edge of seismic change. Corsica had just been sold by the Republic of Genoa to France, much to the ire of many Corsicans who saw their independence extinguished. Among them was Carlo Buonaparte, a lawyer and political idealist who, despite harboring anti-French sentiments, would later align himself with the very regime he had once opposed. Napoleon's family belonged to the minor Corsican nobility. Enough title to secure status, but not enough wealth to ensure comfort. His mother, Letizia Ramolino, was as stern as she was shrewd, raising 8 surviving children in a modest household where pride substituted for luxury. From an early age, Napoleon was shaped by a blend of defiance, ambition, and cultural tension. He was Corsican by blood, Italian in language, and French by imposition. Mini Hook. What happens when a child grows up torn between identities, in a home touched by nobility but shadowed by struggle? That question lingered in every corner of Napoleon's young life. Thanks to his father's connections and opportunism, young Napoleon received a scholarship to study in mainland France. At just 9 years old, he was sent to the College of Autun and later to the Brienne-le-Château Military Academy. This was no ordinary schooling. Imagine being a young Corsican boy, mocked for his accent, his name, even his stature. His peers saw him as foreign, exotic, and inferior. But what they didn't see, what only time would reveal, was the burning resolve within him. At Brienne, Napoleon developed a deep love for mathematics and history, and began devouring the works of Plutarch, especially his biographies of ancient rulers. In these tales, he didn't just see lessons, he saw blueprints. Even as a teenager, he started sketching out strategies, battle formations, and political scenarios. This wasn't just boyish fantasy, it was preparation. At 15, he moved on to the prestigious École Militaire in Paris, where he trained to become an artillery officer. He completed the program in just 1 year instead of 2, thanks to his relentless focus. While most cadets embraced courtly etiquette and flirtations with society, Napoleon immersed himself in the cold precision of cannons and calculations. He graduated in 1785 as a second lieutenant, and thus began a career that would soon reshape the world. Have you ever had to prove yourself in a place where you felt like an outsider? Share your story in the comments. This channel is a community, not just a classroom. This early chapter of Napoleon's life is often overshadowed by the grand battles and iconic portraits. But it is here, in the narrow hallways of Brienne, in the quiet hunger of an overlooked boy, that the seeds of greatness were sown. His early life wasn't glamorous. It was grueling, isolating, and deeply formative. Could a lonely teenager with a foreign accent and no friends already be dreaming of empires? Indeed, he could, and he was. Early military career and the French Revolution, 1785 to 1795. Freshly commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Lafayette Artillery Regiment, Napoleon Bonaparte entered the ranks of a military that, while steeped in aristocratic tradition, was rapidly approaching a crucible of revolution. France in the late 1780s was a nation simmering with unrest. Social inequality, financial collapse, and Enlightenment ideals were hurtling toward a collision that would shake Europe to its core. Stationed in Valence, then Auxonne, Napoleon poured himself into study and reflection. His notebooks from this period overflow with thoughts on military theory, political philosophy, and even early sketches of Republican ideals. He read voraciously. Voltaire, Rousseau, and Machiavelli became his companions in thought. While most young officers embraced social life, Napoleon remained introverted, focused, and occasionally melancholic. What happens when a brilliant mind finds itself in the calm before a revolutionary storm? Does it retreat or sharpen its blade? The revolution erupted in 1789, and the rigid hierarchies of France began to fracture. For Napoleon, a low-ranking officer of noble yet provincial origin, this chaos was a ladder. He returned briefly to Corsica, where the revolution had sparked fierce local divisions. Initially aligning with Corsican nationalist Pasquale Paoli, Napoleon soon found himself alienated. Paoli viewed him as overly sympathetic to the French Republic. Their fallout was decisive. Paoli's followers burned the Bonaparte home, forcing the family to flee back to mainland France. In exile from his own homeland, Napoleon made a fateful choice to embrace France as his nation and the revolution as his opportunity. If you've ever had to leave behind something or someone to follow your convictions, tell us about it below. Your stories matter here. Now back in France and aligned with the revolutionary government, Napoleon's star began its ascent. His first real test came in 1793 at the Siege of Toulon. A port city in southern France had been taken by royalists and handed over to the British fleet. The young artillery captain proposed a bold strategy: seize the heights overlooking the harbor. His plan was adopted, and its execution was surgical. The result? A stunning Republican victory, and the emergence of Napoleon as a name whispered with respect. His reward was promotion to brigadier general at just 24. Imagine being 24 and handed an army because your ideas turned the tide of war. What would you do with that power? But success bred enemies. In 1794, after the fall of Robespierre, Napoleon found himself arrested for supposed Jacobin ties. It was a dangerous time. Political loyalty could shift overnight, and a man's head could follow suit. Fortunately, there was no evidence, and he was released. Yet his career stalled. Until 1795, Royalists attempted to storm the Tuileries in Paris. The revolutionary government was in crisis. General Paul Barras, desperate for a quick-thinking officer, remembered the young Corsican artilleryman from Toulon. Napoleon was given command of the defense. His response? A whiff of grape shot. The rebels were shredded by cannon fire in the streets of Paris. It was ruthless, effective, and unmistakably Napoleon. The event, known as 13 Vendémiaire, made him a hero of the Republic overnight. Paul Barras rewarded him with command of the Army of the Interior and introduced him to a woman who would soon redefine his personal life. Josephine de Beauharnais. She was elegant, connected, and older, a widow of a guillotined aristocrat. Napoleon fell hard. They married in 1796, and shortly afterward, he took command of the Army of Italy. This phase would usher in a new chapter, one that saw the humble Corsican transform into a continental force, rise to political power. The coup of 18 Brumaire, 1799. As 1799 dawned, France was in turmoil. The revolution, once a beacon of liberty, had descended into instability. The Directory, France's governing body, was corrupt, inept, and loathed. Inflation ran rampant. Royalist threats loomed large. Worse, the people were exhausted. From war, from guillotines, from hope betrayed. In this storm, one man saw clarity. Opportunity. What happens when the system is broken? The people are weary, and one ambitious man believes only he can save them. Napoleon returned from his Egyptian campaign with mixed military results, but unmatched celebrity status. Though he had left behind a crumbling mission, the propaganda machine in France spun his adventures into myth. He was portrayed as a visionary commander, a hero of the Republic. Sensing his moment, he conspired with key figures: Emmanuel Sieyès, Lucien Bonaparte, his brother and a powerful politician, and others disillusioned with the Directory. Their goal? To dismantle the broken regime and replace it with something stronger. The plan? A coup, timed with military precision. On 18 Brumaire year E8, November 9th, 1799, troops loyal to Napoleon seized key points in Paris. The legislative councils were pressured. Rumors of Jacobin plots swirled to sow fear. Napoleon stormed the chambers to demand reform, but was met with hostility. Micro-CTA, ever faced a moment where your plan almost fell apart? In public? Share your story below. Let's compare pressure points. His initial speech was rambling, even panicked. Deputies shouted him down. One yelled, "Down with the tyrant!" For a moment, it seemed the coup might collapse. Then Lucien Bonaparte stepped in. As president of the Council of 500, he dramatically declared that his brother was being threatened by radicals and ordered soldiers to intervene. Troops entered the chamber and dispersed the legislators at bayonet point. It was not elegant, but it was effective. That evening, a new provisional government was declared, a three-man consulate, with Napoleon as first consul. What would you do if, overnight, you were handed near absolute power over a wounded nation? Napoleon wasted no time. He moved into the Tuileries Palace, once home to kings, now occupied by a Corsican general with a plan. He reorganized the ministries, stabilized finances, and began crafting a constitution that would centralize authority while appearing republican. He also introduced reforms that gained popular support: fairer taxation, support for agriculture and trade, and a strong administrative framework. He wasn't just seizing power, he was rebuilding France. And the people? Many sighed in relief. After years of chaos, they welcomed order, even if it came with iron gloves. The coup of 18 Brumaire marked the end of the French Revolution. The dream of égalité, liberté, fraternité had yielded to the reality of strong leadership. Napoleon was no longer just a general. He was the axis around which France now spun. Consolidation of power and becoming consul for life, 1799 to 1804. Napoleon Bonaparte was now first consul of the French Republic, a title that, while modest in name, masked the sweeping powers he had accumulated. But a title alone doesn't build an empire. In the 5 years that followed the coup, Napoleon would entrench himself so deeply into France's political fabric that removing him would feel unthinkable. How do you turn temporary power into a permanent throne? Napoleon didn't just ask this question. He answered it with relentless precision. First came legitimacy. Napoleon knew that power without the people was brittle. So, he crafted a new constitution, the Constitution of Year E8. It gave him sweeping executive authority, but under the guise of popular sovereignty. A national plebiscite was held. The results? Overwhelming approval. Were they manipulated? Perhaps. But the message was clear. The people wanted order, and they saw Napoleon as the man to provide it. He transformed France from within. Education reform saw the creation of lycées, schools designed to train a new generation of civil servants. He streamlined France's chaotic tax system, established the Bank of France, and standardized currency. Civil unrest was met with swift military response. Newspapers were censored. Surveillance increased. Was it authoritarian? Yes. Was it effective? Undeniably. Can a nation heal through discipline? Or does order always come at the cost of liberty? One of his most enduring reforms was the Napoleonic Code, or the Civil Code of 1804. It laid the foundation for modern legal systems across Europe and beyond. It enshrined property rights, equality before the law for men, and centralized legal authority. Women, however, were largely excluded. Power remained patriarchal. Napoleon also forged peace with the Catholic Church. The Concordat of 1801 restored relations with the Pope, recognizing Catholicism as the religion of the majority of Frenchmen while maintaining state control. It was a political masterstroke, diffusing religious tension while reinforcing his image as a unifier. All these reforms were not isolated policies. They were steps on a staircase. By 1802, the next elevation came. Another plebiscite was held, this time asking whether Napoleon should be made consul for life. The answer? A resounding yes. If you lived in a time of chaos, would you vote for stability, even if it meant surrendering your voice? Tell us in the comments. History is never as far away as it seems. The transition was nearly complete. France was no longer a revolutionary republic. It was Napoleon's republic, and the people, weary of bloodshed and instability, embraced their new strongman with fervor. Still, opposition lingered in the shadows. Royalists plotted, Jacobins muttered, foreign monarchies bristled. But within France, the image of Napoleon had become synonymous with progress, power, and pride. What makes a man so indispensable that a republic begs him to rule for life? Napoleon's next move would shock Europe. The general who had once fought for the ideals of the revolution was preparing to crown himself. Literally, coronation as Emperor of the French, 1804. December 2nd, 1804, Notre Dame Cathedral. The air was heavy with incense and symbolism. Outside, Parisians gathered, bracing the winter chill. Inside, the vaulted ceilings echoed with chants and ceremony. Dignitaries from across Europe looked on as a man of revolution prepared to crown himself emperor. What kind of man places the crown on his own head? And why does that act still send shivers through history? Napoleon's coronation was not just a political event. It was theater, propaganda, and declaration, all wrapped into one. Pope Pius VII was there, summoned from Rome to bless the occasion. Yet when the moment came, Napoleon took the crown from the Pope's hands and placed it on his own head. It was bold. It was unprecedented. It was Napoleon. This wasn't merely self-aggrandizement. It was messaging. My power comes not from God or bloodline, but from me and from the people who chose me. Josephine, elegantly robed, knelt beside him. Napoleon crowned her empress with equal formality. Their union, tempestuous and strategic, was now sanctified under the eyes of Europe's elite. The ceremony was captured by Louis David, immortalized in oil and canvas. Napoleon at the center, Pope a mere bystander. If you were writing your legacy in one symbolic act, what would it be? Drop it in the comments. Let's see your imagination meet history. The coronation sent shockwaves through Europe. Monarchies sneered, whispered, watched. They had underestimated the Corsican general before. Now, he stood taller than kings. France, once a republic, then a consulate, was now an empire. Can a republic survive if it worships a single man? For the French people, the coronation confirmed what many already felt. Napoleon had become indispensable. Streets erupted in celebrations, but beneath the joy, tensions simmered. Royalists saw betrayal. Revolutionaries saw irony. And yet, ordinary citizens saw something they hadn't felt in years: stability. His regime now rested on more than battlefield victories. It was codified in law, sanctified by religion, and mythologized in art. France's institutions bent around him. Titles were created. Nobility returned, not of birth, but of merit and loyalty to the emperor. Yet as the crown gleamed under candlelight, so too did shadows lengthen. Ambition has no ceiling, and peace, as history teaches, is often the calm before a storm. Military genius, key campaigns and battles, 1804 to 1812. To understand Napoleon, you must follow him to the battlefield. Here, more than in any palace or council chamber, his legend was forged. From 1804 to 1812, he would lead France through a series of military campaigns that rewrote the art of war and reshaped the map of Europe. What does it take to win a continent? Grit? Genius? Or something darker? In 1805, facing a new coalition of enemies, Napoleon struck first. His campaign against Austria culminated in one of his most brilliant victories, the Battle of Austerlitz. On December 2nd, the very anniversary of his coronation, Napoleon lured the Austro-Russian forces into a trap. Outnumbered, he feigned weakness. Then, with precise timing, unleashed his forces upon the center of the enemy line. The result? Decisive, devastating. Austerlitz became the blueprint for strategic deception. He followed with victories at Ulm, Jena-Auerstedt, and Friedland. Each battle showcased different facets of his genius: speed of movement, central coordination, calculated risk. His army, known as La Grande Armée, became a machine of breathtaking discipline and flexibility. Which battle in history fascinates you the most? And why? Let us know in the comments. We might explore it in a future episode. Napoleon didn't just win. He changed how wars were fought. He used the corps system to allow independent units to operate semi-autonomously, ensuring both speed and adaptability. His logistics system allowed his troops to live off the land, moving faster than traditional supply chains. Is war still war when it becomes mathematics? But military might wasn't limited to Europe. Earlier, in his Egyptian campaign, though ultimately a strategic failure, Napoleon demonstrated his ability to turn defeat into legacy. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone, scientific expeditions, and his own writings during the campaign cemented an image of a commander-philosopher. Back in Europe, he dismantled the Holy Roman Empire and restructured German states under the Confederation of the Rhine. Italy, Spain, and much of Central Europe fell under his influence or direct control. However, with every victory, new coalitions emerged. Britain remained unconquered, defiant across the Channel. Napoleon's attempts at economic warfare, the continental system, aimed to blockade British goods. But enforcing it proved difficult and alienated allies. Still, within France and among its satellite states, he was celebrated. Monuments rose, medals glittered, school books carried his name. He was more than a general. He was a symbol of French ascendancy. Yet, under the weight of so many conquests, cracks began to appear. Occupied territories grew resentful. Guerrilla warfare in Spain bled the French army. Nationalism, ironically inspired by French ideals, began to stir among the conquered. Can an empire built by revolution survive its own ripple effects? By 1812, Napoleon stood at the peak of his power. He ruled or influenced nearly all of continental Europe. And yet, instead of consolidating, he looked east, toward Russia, the Napoleonic Empire at its height. From the Atlantic Ocean to the gates of Moscow, from the sands of Egypt to the snows of Poland, the Napoleonic Empire reached an unprecedented scale in European history. At its height, Napoleon controlled or influenced over 70 million people, not through divine right or royal blood, but through conquest, law, and the illusion of unity. What happens when one man holds half a continent in the palm of his hand? By 1811, the French Empire and its satellite states included modern-day France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, parts of Italy, Germany, Croatia, Poland, and even Spain. Family members were installed as monarchs. Joseph Bonaparte in Spain, Louis in Holland, Jerome in Westphalia. These weren't mere favors. They were tools of administration, loyalty, and control. Napoleon's administrative genius extended to how he ruled. His Napoleonic Code replaced feudal laws with a standardized legal framework across many lands. It promoted secularism, centralized authority, and protected private property, values still shaping legal systems today. Public works expanded. Roads, canals, and bridges stitched the empire together. Metric systems were introduced. Censuses taken. A modern civil service emerged. It wasn't just military domination. It was a nation building at imperial scale. Which modern institution do you think owes the most to Napoleon's legacy? Law, education, or civil administration? Drop your take in the comments. But for all its reforms, the empire was still born in war and sustained by it. To maintain dominance, Napoleon demanded loyalty, conscripts, and taxes from his allies and subjects. As the wars dragged on, these demands strained relationships. Resistance grew. Can you impose unity at the barrel of a musket? In Spain, the so-called Spanish Ulcer, a brutal guerrilla war, drained French morale and manpower. In Germany and Italy, national identities began to coalesce against Napoleon, not with him. Ironically, his efforts to spread French revolutionary ideals sparked nationalist awakenings elsewhere, and yet Napoleon kept pushing forward. In 1809, he defeated Austria again at the Battle of Wagram. Seeking legitimacy through dynasty, he divorced Josephine and married Marie Louise of Austria, niece of Marie Antoinette. The marriage symbolized Napoleon's full transformation, from revolutionary upstart to crowned emperor tied to Europe's old order. A son was born in 1811, Napoleon II, dubbed the King of Rome. But as the empire bloomed, it also overstretched. The continental system strained economies. French soldiers were now spread thin, from Lisbon to Warsaw. Behind triumph stood fatigue. How long can a sun shine before it begins to burn itself out? And Napoleon? He knew. He saw cracks. But retreat was never in his vocabulary. He still believed in destiny. His destiny. The next chapter he would write, however, would not be about conquest. It would be about survival. The invasion of Russia and the beginning of decline. 1812. In June 1812, Napoleon launched one of the most ambitious and disastrous campaigns in military history, the invasion of Russia. With over 600,000 troops, the Grande Armée was the largest force Europe had ever seen. But it was also overstretched, multinational, and unprepared for what lay ahead. What happens when a force of 500,000 marches into the unknown, and only a fraction returns? The goal seemed clear: punish Tsar Alexander I for defying the continental system. But behind that goal lurked a personal obsession. Napoleon wanted to deliver a final, undeniable blow to consolidate his empire. He believed a swift campaign would bring Russia to its knees. Instead, the Russians retreated deep into their vast interior, destroying crops, towns, and supplies along the way. The infamous scorched earth strategy. The French advanced, but with every step, they grew weaker. On September 7th, the Battle of Borodino unfolded. A bloodbath with over 70,000 casualties. It was technically a French victory, but a hollow one. The Russian army was not destroyed. When Napoleon entered Moscow, he found it deserted and soon engulfed in flames. The city burned for days, consuming food, shelter, and morale. There was no surrender, no treaty. Only silence. Have you ever achieved something, only to realize it wasn't worth the cost? Share your story? We learn from both victory and regret. Winter descended. Supplies ran low. Disease spread. Discipline crumbled. By October, with no Russian capitulation, Napoleon ordered the retreat. What followed was apocalyptic. Snow blinded, wolves prowled, Cossacks attacked, starvation gripped the men. Horses died by the thousands. Cannons were abandoned. The once mighty Grande Armée disintegrated into a desperate frostbitten exodus. What does greatness look like when it freezes? By the time Napoleon crossed the Niemen River back into friendly territory, fewer than 100,000 remained, and many of them were unfit for combat. It wasn't just a defeat, it was devastation. The myth of Napoleon's invincibility cracked. Across Europe, occupied nations stirred. The Sixth Coalition, Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, Sweden, and more, began to unite against him. And Napoleon? He blamed fate. He blamed the cold. But deep down, he knew. The seeds of collapse had been sown in ambition, unchecked. The War of the Sixth Coalition and Abdication, 1813 to 1814. The invasion of Russia had cracked the foundation. Now the walls began to fall. In 1813, the Sixth Coalition struck hard. Britain, Russia, Prussia, Austria, Sweden, and smaller German states joined forces to bring down the man who had once humbled them all. Napoleon, though battered, responded swiftly. He raised new armies, drafted younger and older men alike, and returned to the field. What drives a man to fight on when the world has turned against him? Despite dwindling resources and a bleeding empire, Napoleon showed flashes of his old brilliance. At Lutzen and Bautzen, he won battles. His energy was unmatched. But the tide was too strong. In October 1813 came the Battle of Leipzig, the Battle of the Nations. Over 600,000 soldiers clashed. Napoleon faced four fronts, his army exhausted and outnumbered. After 3 days of brutal fighting, he was forced to retreat. It was his largest defeat, and yet he did not surrender. He withdrew into France. There, in 1814, with enemy armies crossing the borders, Napoleon waged a desperate defense. He moved with lightning speed, winning battles at Brienne, Champaubert, and Montmirail. But it was not enough. The Allies kept coming. Paris fell in March. Have you ever fought for something long after others gave up? Share that story. It may inspire someone who's still in the fight, backed into a corner, betrayed by some of his marshals, and pressured by his political allies. Napoleon agreed to abdicate. On April 11th, 1814, he signed the Treaty of Fontainebleau. The once great emperor of the French was exiled to the tiny island of Elba in the Mediterranean. What happens when a man who ruled the world is reduced to ruling a rock? But exile did not break him. In Elba, Napoleon reorganized the local economy, reformed agriculture, and trained a small army. He watched Europe nervously, saw the restored Bourbons bungle their return, and listened to whispers of discontent in France. The fire was not out. The 100 Days and the Final Defeat, 1815. On February 26, 1815, Napoleon slipped past British patrols and set sail from Elba with a small band of loyal troops. Within days, he landed on the French coast. No blood was spilled. No army could stop him. What happens when a ghost returns? Not to haunt, but to reclaim. As Napoleon marched north, garrison after garrison defected. Soldiers once sworn to Louis XVIII turned their coats at the mere sight of him. At Grenoble, he stepped in front of royal troops and declared, "If there is one among you who would kill his emperor, here I am." Not a single shot was fired. In just 20 days, he reached Paris. The king fled. Napoleon was once again Emperor of the French. He promised peace. He promised reform. But Europe didn't believe him. The Seventh Coalition, led by Britain and Prussia, mobilized immediately. Wellington in Belgium, Blücher on the move. Napoleon acted fast. He planned to strike before the Allies could unite. It would be a campaign of speed, strategy, and risk. On June 16th, he defeated the Prussians at Ligny. But delays, miscommunication, and the resilience of Allied forces conspired against him. June 18th, 1815. Waterloo. The battle was close. Rain had turned the fields to mud. French cavalry charges failed to break Wellington's infantry squares. When Blücher's Prussians arrived late in the day, the tide turned. The Imperial Guard, Napoleon's last reserve, was broken. Napoleon's dream ended in the mud of Waterloo. What's your Waterloo? That moment when you gave your all, and it still wasn't enough. Share your story. Strength lies in honesty. He returned to Paris, defeated but not destroyed. But the political tide had shifted. France no longer wanted another war. He abdicated, this time for good. On June 22nd, the Allies would not make the same mistake twice. They exiled him again, but this time, far from Europe. To St. Helena, how do you cage a man who once moved empires? St. Helena was a remote, windswept island in the South Atlantic, isolated, harsh, final. There would be no escape. Death and posthuma. M.M.'s legacy. Napoleon spent his final years on the island of St. Helena, a jagged rock in the South Atlantic under constant British watch. He was guarded, monitored, and increasingly isolated. The man who had once commanded the attention of continents now lived in Longwood House, damp, windswept, and far from the marble halls of power. How does a man who once dictated the fate of nations come to terms with silence? He dictated his memoirs to loyal aides, including General Bertrand and Count de Montholon. He reworked history in his image, portraying himself not as a tyrant, but as a reformer misunderstood by monarchs and betrayed by fate. In these final texts, we see both propaganda and poetry. The battle for legacy had begun long before death. Despite deteriorating health, he maintained discipline, structured routines, and occasional philosophical reflections. He walked the island's rough terrain, stared out to sea, and spoke often of France, of destiny, of unfinished work. If you could leave one message behind for the world to remember you by, what would it be? Write it in the comments. Your legacy matters too. Napoleon died on May 5, 1821. The cause remains debated: stomach cancer, arsenic poisoning, or perhaps simply the slow erosion of a soul exiled from purpose. His final words? France, armée, tête d'armée, Josephine. Can a man die a prisoner and still win the war for memory? Initially buried on the island, his remains were returned to France in 1840 by King Louis-Philippe. The tomb at Les Invalides in Paris became a site of pilgrimage. Statues rose, books were written, legends solidified. In defeat, he became immortal. In the centuries since, Napoleon has been endlessly debated: tyrant or genius, savior or despot. The truth, as always, lies in the tension between. He shaped modern Europe, redefined leadership, and challenged the limits of one man's will. His name echoes in law codes, military academies, literature, even marketing. Analysis: how a humble soldier rose to everything. Napoleon Bonaparte's ascent from a provincial Corsican boy to ruler of a continent is not simply a tale of war or politics. It is a case study in the raw mechanics of power, vision, and timing. Is greatness born or made under fire? Several forces converged to lift Napoleon beyond his station. First, talent. His military mind was unlike any of his time, flexible, adaptive, audacious. His understanding of terrain, speed, morale, and logistics allowed him to win battles where others would have only seen defeat. Second, opportunity. The French Revolution dismantled old structures. Nobles fled, kings fell, and for a moment in history, ability mattered more than birth. Napoleon seized that moment, not just with cannons, but with credibility. Third, ambition. He was relentless, driven. Even as a young officer, he wrote about destiny with messianic zeal. Unlike many, he didn't wait for history to call. He grabbed the pen and started writing. What moment in your life made you realize you had to take control? Share below. Your story may be the spark someone else needs. But no success exists in a vacuum. His rise was also enabled by a France desperate for order, an army eager for glory, and a Europe unsure how to respond. Was Napoleon a product of revolution, or its ultimate betrayal? He redefined leadership, merging charisma with calculation, glory with governance. He inspired loyalty not just through fear, but by articulating a vision. Soldiers marched for him, people voted for him, enemies respected him. Yet his flaws were integral to his myth. Pride blinded him, power isolated him. His refusal to compromise ultimately undid his empire. But even in failure, he etched himself into memory. That's power, not just to lead men, but to outlive them. In analyzing Napoleon's rise, we see not just a historical figure, but a mirror. He reflected the best and worst of human aspiration, the courage to rise, the brilliance to rule, and the hubris to fall. Conclusion: the enduring fascination with Napoleon. So, what is it about Napoleon Bonaparte that keeps him alive in our imagination? Is it the drama of his rise, from a minor Corsican noble to emperor of nearly all Europe? Is it the brilliance of his strategies, the eloquence of his proclamations, or the tragic arc of his downfall? Or is it simply this, that in one lifetime, he dared to stretch the human condition to its edge? Why do we still talk about a man who died over 200 years ago, as if he just left the room? Napoleon forces us to wrestle with difficult questions. Can ambition be moral? Can one person change the course of history? And what is the price of greatness? He was the architect of modern institutions, but also the breaker of nations, a liberator to some, a conqueror to others. He reshaped not only borders, but the very idea of leadership. In many ways, he was the first modern ruler, commanding not only armies, but hearts, yeans, and myths. What did you take away from this journey? Comment below. We want to hear your reflections. His legacy is unfinished because it lives on, not just in books and statues, but in our continued search for meaning, for vision, for that elusive force that bends history. And maybe, just maybe, in every life that dares to reach beyond its limits, there's a little echo of Napoleon,